This computer. All right, we're off. Welcome back. There are fewer people today. I see 24, I think, which is actually quite a good number, something much closer to what I had originally envisioned. I'm sorry to everyone we scared away last time. But let me emphasize again that this is a very loose affiliation of like-minded people, which is to say that everyone is always free to come and go as they like. These are strange times, and this is a strange project, and so no one is required to be here. Though, of course, you know, the same thing that always holds here. You'll get more out of it if you're here more regularly and you do all the reading. So that's that. That's one of the advantages. Another advantage is you don't have to wear pants. Also, you can smoke. This is the first time in a long time I've seen anyone smoking during a seminar, which is pretty cool. So those are some of the advantages. We're recording now. Okay, so Jacob McNulty is there. Good. He's one of our key players today for reasons that I will explain. Also, before we take off, I wanted to say that I've just sent a rough schedule for today via chat. So you should be able to access that in chat. And if you're joining us for the first time today, chat is our primary means of direct back and forth during the seminar. And one of the reasons for that is that it's a lot less disruptive to jump in with a chat comment that everybody can hear than it is to turn on your mic and to start talking. Though, of course, you will be invited to turn on your mics and start talking at various points throughout the seminar. So have a look at the schedule I sent. And one other thing that's very important, and we had a few problems last time. If you've got babies or chickens or music or whatever in your vicinity, or if you've got a cough, please make sure your microphone is off. All right, so those are some of the preliminaries. I also wanted to say very briefly that there is no obvious terminus ad quem to this thing that we're doing together. I haven't thought of any official purposes to which it might serve. Some people have asked me if there could potentially be any official purposes, and I would just say, you know, if you're an undergraduate or a graduate student and you are interested in kind of relaying this into an independent study sort of paper, I don't see why that should not be possible. I'm a officially licensed person, and we could arrange that, I'm sure. So that's only obviously if you want to do that. All right, so I had the first 5 minutes, which we've already used up, cordoned off for technical questions. Are there any such? Does anybody have any technical concerns about how this unfolds that you would like to air?
Yeah, so I just sent a question through the chat. Would it be possible for you to send the schedule again? Because I think the people who joined after you first
Sure,
joined.
sure. I'm trying, my list is getting pretty cumbersome, and I'm trying to make sure everyone gets all the information, but if some of you are coming in late, it's, you know, it's pretty hard for me sometimes to remember who has what. And also, hi Whitney, nice to see you
Hi,
here.
nice to see you
Uh,
too.
okay, so okay, Jacob Greenstein says that I can mute everyone automatically while people can unmute themselves. I'm going to mute all. Current and new participants will be muted. Continue. Okay, you are all hereby muted, but you can hear me, right? Okay, that's good. Now, uh, uh, so far it's been pretty unidirectional. It's been me giving you a lot of input. I want to, as we go on, encourage more bidirectionality. Are there any lingering general Kant questions from last time? Anything that you felt we started to address, but then got sidetracked, or the time was too short, or anything like that? No, nothing. Okay, in future sessions, I'll encourage you to come with such general questions at the beginning, though today it's obviously not necessary. All right, I wanted to take, so looking ahead, I think Jake McNulty is there. Jake is a postdoctoral fellow, as I understand, in philosophy at NYU. And he has kindly volunteered to be our first rapporteur. That is the person who will, in this session, summarize the principal points of the reading for us. And we're not going to do that right away. That's going to be a bit later on today. First of all, though, thank you, Jake, for volunteering. Second of all, let me just say, and I want to make this clear, that Jake is perhaps a bit more familiar with this material than average in this group, maybe a lot more familiar with this material. So I fully anticipate that he's going to give us a pretty damn good presentation today, which is great. But I don't want his excellence in the matter to make anyone think, if this is the first time they're coming to Kant's work, that they are not similarly well positioned to present. And I encourage some particular bold Kant beginner to take a stab at it in the coming weeks. All right, before we turn to him, I think I'd like to take 15 to 20 minutes to maybe wrap up some of the concerns that we started to pursue last time. We had some very interesting discussion that might have taken us far afield from the critique itself. We did a lot of intellectual history background, which we will not be doing every time, but sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it is unavoidable. And for me, one thing I mentioned a week ago is that as someone whose primary scholarly subdisciplinary specialization is the history and philosophy of the life sciences. Uh, for that reason, the second part, the critique of teleological judgment, has always been what I've focused on most. It's what I've taught most extensively. It's what I think about the most. And so I myself am somewhat out of my area of immediate expertise when I start trying to engage with the critique of aesthetic judgment, or indeed when I deign to teach this massive and weighty and weird introduction that we're going to be talking about today. Rereading the two introductions for today, my principal thoughts were, first of all, man, this is weird and hard, and man, there are a lot of technical terms, and man, this is amazing the way it reaches back to the previous two critiques and kind of enlists the whole critical project. This is going to be really hard. But also that kind of dread was leavened a bit by how already in this early part of the third critique, it's clearly a lot of fun too. And Kant is clearly loosening up, perhaps for the first time in his critical project, and letting a lot of other kind of what I would describe as curiosities slip in. And I thought this might be a good occasion to give you 2 minutes on some of the biography of Kant's work, or the biography behind Kant's work that you might not know. Kant was, for most of his life, a docent at the University of Königsberg, which meant, among other things, that the only way he could get paid, the only way he could make a living, was by teaching stuff of broad general interest. And part of the upshot of this is that he wrote a lot about a lot. For example, and this is the example that jumped out at me because it slips into the introduction to the third critique. He wrote a lot about what we would call physical geography, or surveying, as Geyer and Wood translate it. And was keen on studying the hydrology and the hills and so on of the Königsberg region. And in general, with the passing references to surveying, to crystallography, and to all sorts of exact sciences, I think in the critique of judgment, Kant, in a very interesting way, allows some of his wide-rangingness to kind of get thrown into the pot of transcendental philosophy, right? And the boundary starts to break down. Now, at some point in the introduction, he says something to the effect that, listen, this is a transcendental project. You'll go easy on me, I hope, if I fail to provide anything of use to what might be called culture, which is to say, to the cultivation of appreciators of art and nature. That's not what I'm doing here, he says. And in a way, he's, so to speak, covering his ass, in anticipation of all those people who will, in fact, come back at him and say, you know what, Kant, you're a real provincial yokel who doesn't really know what good art is. And Kant is, by way of anticipation, saying, that might be so, right? But that's not what we're doing here. And I find that comment really interesting because, in a sense, even if he's trying to deny that he's engaging with the multifarious world out there, still, this is a work, unlike the first and second critiques, where his engagement with that world actually seeps in nonetheless. And whether he is a good art critic or not, whether he knows the true value of music or wine tasting or culinary science, it's nonetheless the case that we get a pretty rich picture of him as a person interested in so many different things, right? So that's just a bit of an aside. I wanted also to take another maybe 10 minutes to return to the question of some of the general concepts that I'll also return to again after Jacob's talk, that we started to discuss last time. Now, in the introduction, you will have seen that there's a strong argument. You'll recall last time we tried to kind of address this most general question: what is the third critique about? Is it about art? Well, maybe, but in that case, only half of it, because there's also the second half that seems to be about natural beings, or as Kant calls them, organized beings, or as he calls the whole second half, the critique of teleological judgment. And in the introductions, we get a strong sense, I think, in fact, I've been struck over the past week as to how strong this sense is, that even if we've got these two halves on those topics, the critique of the power of judgment is about neither of these topics, right? That was one of the theories we considered last time. That I think is the most viable theory by the time we get to the end of the introductions. And that is to say that he is mobilizing the discussion of the aesthetic and the teleological to address the question that really interests him, which is judgment. And the reason judgment interests him is because it is such an important kind of bridging concept to bring together the loose or not yet fully connected strands of the first two critiques, which is to say, to bring together theoretical and practical philosophy within the critical project, right? So by the end of the introductions, that is the strongest interpretation of the nature of Kant's philosophical project in the two critiques. Sorry, in the third critique, in the two halves of the third critique. Now, that's certainly not to say, as we go on, that you can't get an aesthetics out of the third critique, or that you can't get a, to speak anachronistically, philosophy of biology out of the third critique. It's just to say that those are, so to speak, delivered as byproducts of Kant's real project. I'm not arguing that today. I'm suggesting that that is the strongest sense one gets of Kant's project by the end of the introductions. Does that sound fair? Are there any comments or input on that? Everyone is invited to give us input here, except Jake McNulty, because I think that's going to come soon. No, okay. That's kind of my own sort of reader's report, so to speak, on my own most recent engagement with the introductions. A few more words. I think on the schedule I sent you in the chat, I gave you a list of concepts that I want to ensure that we've mastered by the end of today: aesthetic, teleology, purposiveness, taste, technique, beauty, and sublimity. I wanted to at least engage a little bit, and I suppose also judgment will be important here. I should have included that in the list, but maybe because it's so obvious that it's important, I just left it out. Let me at least, before, in kind of the 8 minutes that I have reserved for myself, promise that by the end of today, we will have mastered these concepts. At least, I won't promise, I'll express the hope that by the end of today, we will have mastered these concepts. I wanted, maybe in the 8 minutes left reserved to me, to try to say a little bit about the kind of lingering elements from the first two critiques. Another thing that struck me on this most recent rereading of the introductions is how important the schema developed in the first critique is for making sense of the project here, namely the schema of reason, understanding, and intuition. I'm starting from the highest and most exalted faculty and going down to the most kind of primitive or basic. And I wanted to just encourage you, if you have not read the first critique, to perhaps at least study up on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on the first critique, especially as concerns the trio of these concepts. But at least let me say that they're important here as a kind of in connection with Kant's attempt to bridge the previous critiques. In the first critique, reason is that which does not or cannot provide its ideas to the understanding. The transcendental ideas, or the ideas of pure reason, are God, the soul, and the world. It's probably most difficult to understand why the world should be among those three. So maybe it would be most useful to focus on God and the soul, and in particular on God. I think, as was suggested last time by Graham, God is looming in the third critique in very interesting ways, in particular in the reflections on teleology in nature. Kant will frequently say that we have a kind of analogy of artisanship in the design of nature. And you might be wondering, why is this an analogy? Why can't just come right out and say that nature is the product of a master craftsman or artisan? And one of the reasons he can't do that is because of what he has already shown in the first critique, namely that you can't have a concept of God given in the understanding in the way that classic full speed ahead, no holds barred metaphysicians like Leibniz were perfectly happy to do, right? Leibniz was always perfectly happy to tell you what God is up to and how powerful and great and all-knowing God is and stuff like that. And in turn, to tell you how it is that the rational order of nature reflects this omnipotence and omniscience and omnibenevolence of God, right? So Kant pushes God out to the faculty of reason, which is to say, out of the faculty of the understanding in the first critique. And it's in part for that reason that now in the third critique, we have such a challenge making sense of what appears to be the purposiveness of nature, right? So that's one of the ways in which the first critique's conclusions, or perhaps aporiae, loom for us here. Now, as for the faculty of the understanding and intuition, I think I'm not going to summarize all of what Kant has to say in the first critique. I did that a little bit last time already. Recall that Kant says that David Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers when Hume showed that the concept of cause is something that can't be given in experience. Kant will transform or revamp causality on Hume's instigation into one of several concepts of the understanding, which is to say, one of the concepts that we bring to our intuitions, and I'll get to intuition as the most primitive faculty momentarily. Causality is one of the concepts of the understanding that we bring to our intuitions of space and time, which are the pure forms of intuition, such that in bringing that concept to our intuitions, we elevate them to what can be called experience, right? So what is experience? It is the application of concepts of the understanding to the pure forms of intuition in such a way as to elevate what would otherwise just be indiscriminate. It's hard to say what it would be like. Where our apprehension of the external world would be, sometimes the way I like to put it is it would be something like what a security camera apprehends. It takes it all in, but it doesn't have experience. I think we can agree. So in turn, Kant says, just to kind of try to tie these three together, intuition and understanding and reason, in turn, all the ideas of reason do in this kind of general operation of our human minds is to regulate rather than to constitute. That is to say, our ideas of God, the soul, and the world as totality, are not presented to the understanding, which, to put that in clearer terms, perhaps, is to say that they're not part of what we are able to know. Rather, the transcendental ideas, God, the soul, and the world as totality, simply regulate transcendentally what we are able to know, right? And so that schema, that tripartite scheme of the faculties of the mind, as presented in the first critique, is, and the way that this tripartite scheme accounts for what Kant calls experience, is pretty important for following what Kant is trying to do in the third critique. And I just summarized it very, very quickly. And there are a lot of Wikipedia-style summaries out there. If you want to go back over these important terms, as usual, I would much prefer that you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which has its shortcomings, but on matters like these, it's very, very good. So I encourage you to review that schema in more detail, and to convince yourself that you've mastered it. All right, I'm 2 minutes over time. I'd like to invite Jacob McNulty to turn on his microphone and do his thing. And as usual, let me just say, first of all, I haven't seen any chat comments for a while, and as was recommended last time, chat comments are really great thing to get when you're speaking into the void like this. They're the one thing that kind of gives the person who's speaking a sense that she or he is not speaking into the void, but is actually speaking to a group of interested people. So Jinyong says, "We're here." Yeah, I mean, little merely phatic exclamations like that even are great. And I say that in part for Jake McNulty, because he's about to start shouting into the void. He's going to learn what it's like. So shall I just turn it over to you, Jake?
Sure.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Hi. All right. So I don't have a formal presentation prepared. What I did was I read and made some notes of things I thought were important. And so I figured I would just speak more or less extemporaneously or from my notes, and you should really feel free to interrupt me at any time. As it happens, I'm currently teaching a course over Zoom on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and it struck me as I reread the prefaces and introductions to the third critique that it's quite poorly structured and dense, even by Kantian standards. He's one of the most difficult authors that there is in the entire history of philosophy, and yet there's a kind of unique difficulty of this discussion. And at first I was thinking of that as an obstacle to presenting on it to you here today, but I've now come to think of it as something that can itself be made a topic. Why is this a problem? Why is this topic a problem for Kant? Why does he keep returning to the same points over and over again? Why does he, I'm reminded of the psychoanalytic expression, working through. Why is he working through these issues by constantly circling back to them? And I think it's really, I hope this doesn't sound somehow disrespectful of the author of the text, but actually a good way to approach the third critique is to say Kant has unfinished business. there are things that he's somehow just about to tie up the loose ends of his critical system and complete it and usher in this new era in the history of philosophy. And something doesn't quite fit. Art, biology, the faculty of judgment, whatever exactly it is you want to call it. Something doesn't quite fit, and what we have doesn't quite fit together, or doesn't quite hang together in the way we think it should. And so there is a kind of tortured quality to the discussion that I think is actually not, I don't think I'm just projecting it onto this. I think there really is a way in which these topics are a bit of a problem for Kant. Now, I am a bit biased here because I focus on Romanticism and German idealism and continental philosophy more generally. And there are people who are critics of Kant, and the way they read him, sort of speaking very, very broad brush about it, is that, well, Kant of the first two critiques is the Enlightenment, and Kant of the third critique is the beginning of something else, whatever it is we want to call that, post. So for example, the topics of life and beauty, you could do a lot worse describing Romanticism than to put those at the top of the list. We have a scientific topic that doesn't fit comfortably in the Newtonian worldview, and we have a topic in aesthetics, which for various reasons doesn't fit or doesn't fit so well. And so I'm sort of a big on, well, I mean, I've said this, but just ways in which there's a kind of unresolved or there's Kant has unfinished business from the first critiques. These topics are a problem for him, and understanding why, I think, can dispel a lot of the confusion. Okay, so let me now
Can I just jump in for a second? Sorry, I don't know if it's going to be unwieldy to jump in. I'll try, but tell me to stop, Jake, if it's annoying. I just wanted to say that last time and today I have not even uttered so much as a word about the legacy of Kant's third critique. I've only looked at forerunners and what kind of is building up to it. And so it's great to have someone who works on German Romanticism giving us kind of the 1790 and after perspective, even if you don't discuss those figures directly, shining a light backwards onto the third critique, I think is really a valuable contribution. So I'll just.
Yeah, I mean, and the reason I say it is also in the way of motivation, because if you're coming to Kant for the first time, there's no question that, the more famous, the more important historical, the first two critiques really do tower over the third. So why mess around with the third? Answer, because it's a chink in the armor. Because it's a little bit of a place in which Kant has to find room for things that don't quite fit, and his perhaps failure to do so, or at least the difficulties he encounters, open the door to every anti-Kantian who comes after to say, aha, this is where Kant kind of begins to sort of see past the limits of his critical system, and it's the sort of opening to something new, something different, something post, something not Enlightenment, but whatever we are now. I don't know, postmodern, post this, post that. Okay, so there's one thing I wanted to say. Now, just to dive in more to the content. So both introductions, and I guess, one of them is a draft and one of them is the published version, but both of them start with this very involved discussion of the meaning of the term technical. And I think here the thing to say, and I would like to make quick work of it, he's just trying to clear a space for a new meaning of the term which diverges from the meaning he gave it in his earlier practical philosophy. So technical does not mean knowledge of baking or of how to, ballistics or firing a cannon. It's not, as it were, how to applied knowledge. He wants to clear us and there is a role for that in Kant's practical philosophy, which is his moral philosophy. Again, even there, practical does not mean applied, it means moral. Practical as the sort of facet of reason that affects the world, as opposed to the facet of reason that kind of lets things flood in and tries to understand them, theoretical and practical, sometimes called direction of fit, more recent philosophy. One of them acts in the world, the other one tries to know the world. Anyway, he wants to clear a space for a new meaning of the term technical, which becomes important in the subsequent section. So I would just propose that we sort of table that issue. He's just basically saying, when you see technical, do not think applied. You know, if you want to make a cake, this is what you should do. If you want to win a battle, this is what you should do. What corresponds in his moral philosophy to what are called hypothetical imperatives. You know, give me the end and then I find the most efficient means. Nothing to do with the sense of the word technical he will introduce in subsequent sections. Okay, so what is that sense? Well, I'll get to it in a moment. But okay, so those are sort of the discussions that take up the first few pages of both introductions. Then he begins to sort of introduce this new sense of the term technical by raising a possibility. The possibility is that the faculty of judgment, alongside the faculty of reason and the faculties of understanding. Now, okay, just a very small point. Why does he compare those? Well, it's not really about, well, okay, it's slightly more complicated than just comparing the three faculties. What it's really about is comparing the three critiques. Because in each of the three critiques, a different faculty, it's not just that each treats a different faculty. In fact, they all treat all the faculties. It's that in each one, a different faculty is in charge or rules or is in the driver's seat. So in practical, in theoretical philosophy, the understanding rules. Mm-hmm. As theoreticians, our job is to understand. It is not to do what reason does, which is to comprehend, to try to speculate on what the nature of the whole world is, like Justin was saying. So the understanding is in charge there. The understanding says, you want to speculate and do what reason does and ask, you know, when did was there a first moment in time and when did the universe begin and does the universe have an outermost limited space? Forget it. For science, you know, for scientific purposes, we just want to understand, you know, what's in front of our noses, more or less. So, the understanding rules in the first critique, the theoretical philosophy. Reason then gets to rule in the practical philosophy, and part of this sort of drama of Kant's project when he says it's going to deny reason to make room for faith is to say, if you want to know where reason does its job, where this exalted faculty you have, you know, is most useful, don't look at natural science, philosophy, all your theorizing about the world. Look at moral action. That's where reason really steps into the limelight and does its thing. And that's a major departure from everybody who came before, who think of reason as the tool we use to kind of know the most fundamental things about the world. And Kant, you know, when you've gotten through the first critique, you think reason, well, maybe it's a kind of tumor. I mean, it's there and it's not useful. And in fact, it can create problems for us as far as trying to know the world goes. What's it for? What it's for is morality. And in fact, a lot of the things that reason goes on about in the theoretical sphere, in metaphysics, God, the soul, and the world, they get sort of kicked out, pushed out the front door, theoretically speaking. We can't know them, only so they can be brought in the side window of morally, because we can have a moral orientation towards them. So that's the sense in which reason rules in the second critique. So Kant now wants to suggest, okay, there's a third faculty I haven't yet discussed. It's the faculty of judgment. And what is it to judge? Well, you take some particular case before, I mean, at least in the central instance, and later he'll distinguish between determining and reflective judgment. I'm not gonna worry about it now. Okay, so in the central instance, you have some particular given to you by sensible intuition, because that's what sensible intuition does. Visual experience of this cup. And I need to find a concept for it. I need to find a category to bring it under. I need to find some class it belongs to. I'm speaking loosely and using other terms than Kant's just for the sake of clarity. Like, what is it? And what it is to judge of this thing is to say, A is B. This is a cup, or this is an artifact, or this, you know, I don't know, comes from IKEA, or I don't know what. But I find some general concept to subsume it under. Okay, so Kant now says, so we know in the other critiques that each of these faculties has a law that it gives to itself. Each of these faculties has a sort of modus operandi. And in the practical case, in terms of reason, practical reason, that's the moral law, the categorical imperative, you know, maybe you know a little something about. That's morality. In the theoretical case, it's really the really principles sort of undergirding natural science and mathematics and things like that. So what's it going to be for the faculty of judgment? What's its modus operandi going to be? Now, just stepping back for a minute, you might ask, well, why is Kant asking this at all? Why does he care? Why does he, the topic is science, Kant tells you about a faculty and how it works. The topic is morality, he tells you about another faculty and how it works. The topic is art, third faculty. What's with all the faculties? Who cares? And I guess I would just say that Kant takes it to be his major innovation in philosophy, that we don't just ask how things stand with a certain subject matter as it exists out there in the world, as if there were some unproblematic way by which we could just intuit or come to know it. We ask, how is it that beings like ourselves come to grips with that thing, Kant? But you don't ask Kant what he thinks about art. You ask what he thinks about the faculty of judgment, which is in charge of art. Or you don't ask him what he thinks about, the heavenly bodies or the planets and stars. You ask him what he thinks about the understanding, which, comes to grips cognitively with them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's Kant's, he thinks of as his Copernican revolution in philosophy. It's no longer the planet, everything else that's moving, and we who are stationary and are kind of clocking them, tracking them. It's rather we who are active. It's our faculties that are kind of doing the heavy lifting in terms of coming to grips with these things. Okay, so that's just my little side note on who cares about all these faculties. Pardon it's not an official seminar, so you can't, complain to the dean.
You don't even have to wear pants, so.
Well, I am wearing pants, but I insist on, I'll wear pants, but I insist on my entitlement to swear. Okay, so what then is the rule? Okay, so practical reason, morality. Theoretical reason, or the understanding, let's say, natural science, principles like every event has a cause, quantity is always conserved in every change, blah, blah, blah. What's the principle of judgment, the faculty of judgment, which he just kind of introduces from nowhere, and we can talk a little more about why he even thinks there's such a thing. What's its principle? Okay, well, remember, we take the particular cup, we find a category for it. So, Kant says, well, then its principle must just be nothing other than the assumption that in any given case we're apt to come across in our experience, there's a category to fit this thing into. I'm not going to come across something completely anomalous. And it's not going to be that, every day when I come, there are just going to be new types of things ad infinitum so that I can never know whether things, are such as to fit into a small number of certain general classes or categories or kinds, right? So that every damn thing I encounter is new, sui generis, one of a kind, and I can never find a category for it because I've never seen one before. I assume the world is not that way when I go about in it and try to classify things. And in fact, I think he's got this nice quote, and I'll here kind of skip ahead in the order I gave myself, where he says, could Linnaeus have hoped to outline a system of nature if he had had to worry that if he found a stone that he called granite, this might differ in its internal constitution from every other stone, which nevertheless looked just like it, and all he could hope to find were always individual things, as it were, isolated for the understanding, and never a class of them that could be brought under concepts of genus and species. So that's the kind of horror scenario that Kant thinks the faculty of judgment and its presuppositions will enable us to avoid. This idea that everything is, new and one of a kind and anomalous, and that we can't, as it were, classify in the way that Linnaeus did by bringing specific things under, general categories. Because there's no reason, why should the world be set up that way? Why shouldn't every single damn thing you encounter in your life be different and one of a kind? There's no reason it shouldn't be. You can't rule it out as a matter of fact. Yeah, that's right. So somebody says that's what Henry Allison calls the specter of empirical chaos. Talk about that in a minute. Yeah, but that is what it is. Then there's another kind that Allison calls transcendental chaos. So if you got your head around this one, it gets more complicated because there's a separate problem with which this one kind of intersects or interlocks, and which Kant is trying to solve them both at once. And that feeds into my theme of unfinished business, because the other one really brings us more direct back to the heart of the first critique. Okay, so so that's he says, so Kant speculates this is the law that the power of judgment gives in itself. For every particular a universal, and ideally we can, as it were, organize we can always reduce multiplicity to unity. All these things, similar looking things, I can always bring under the category of cup, and I can even bring that category under a smaller one. And it's meant to be true of both empirical laws and empirical concepts. So it's not like the concept cup necessarily, it's also principles like, for example, it's one of Kant's examples, but it's also timely. Viruses cause colds. I can bring it under an ever smaller number of principles until I get all the way up to something very general, like every event has a cause. I don't know. I don't know anything about science, but the physicists, they're always trying to sort of show that of the 5 forces we know about, you can sort of collapse them into 3, and then you can collapse the 3 into 2 and collapse them into 1. And with what right do they assume that? Well, Kant would say the power, because our faculties are set up in such a way, and we have this faith that nature is itself set up in that way. It's not just a kind of cruel trick on us that we find universals for particulars, right? But we live in a world in which that is just an epistemically completely irresponsible activity that finds no correlate in the way things are organized. No, the world is set up for us to know it, or for us to judge of it, let's say. Okay, so, and an equivalent way to put this is just that the faculty of judgment thinks of nature as organized into a system. So a system is something where you always, you have these sort of highest genera, and they divide into species and divide down, and there's some systematic organization or hierarchy whereby every multiplicity of things you have can be organized under smaller and smaller numbers of principles. And it's not just an aggregate, right? It's not just that there's this and there's that and the other thing, and there's no systematic unity or interrelations between them. So that's the contrast, an aggregate and a system. Important sort of contrast that he'll lean on a lot. Okay, so that's what the faculty of judgment does, and I'll just quote again on page 9. Somebody asked if I could give page numbers. Happy to do it. Sorry, I haven't so far. There is still possible such an infinity of infinite multiplicity of empirical laws and such a great heterogeneity of forms in nature that the concept of system in accordance with these laws must be entirely alien to the understanding, and neither the possibility, let alone the necessity of such a whole can be conceived. Okay, so that's page 9. All right, so now yet another way to put this. Okay, so Ethan Curry asks, well, is the world of things in themselves, things considered apart from what our cognitive faculties do to them to process them and make them knowable, is that world organized as a system? And I'll get to that in a minute, but this is very much Kant thinks is something that only holds from our point of view. Not only do we have no justification for going further and saying, this is the way things in themselves are, we don't even have the weaker justification of saying, this is the way all appearances from the human standpoint must be. So Kant, there's a kind of funny ambivalence about the third critique, where on the one hand, Kant needs these ideas to complete the system. On the other hand, he will constantly sort of downplay and downgrade them by saying that they have some really second or third, even third-rate status, you might say. So regulative, not constitutive, or they have a certain use, but they're not cognitive. They don't give us all the things that Kant will tell us, like that nature is organized in a system, or that we need to look at it as if God set it up that way, or that individual natural products are proposed. All of it is going to go in this box of being merely regulative and not constitutive, where I think it's pretty clear that's a way of downgrading it. That's a way of saying, look, this is not a scientific finding on a par with, whatever, just germ theory of disease, and it's not a transcendental philosophical discovery on a par with Kant's discovery, demonstration that every event has a cause and Hume was wrong, and we know this. This is has some lesser status. So on the one hand, it clinches the system, it ties up the loose ends. On the other hand, it's sort of third rate, not even second rate, because Kant already has made things second rate by saying this is just true of the world of appearances, not of things themselves. Now it's third rate, even worse. And that's a big sort of disappointment for people following. They say, well, on the one hand, he wants to place life and beauty at the pinnacle of his system, and on the other hand, he wants to shrink back and say, no, they're merely regulative, they're not constitutive, they're not on a par with, the causal principle in natural science or the moral law or anything like that. They are third rate. That's the way I think of it, and it's glib and it's a little brusque, but I think it's fundamentally right. Kant scholars have a sort of professional financial interest in making it more complicated than it is. I'm not one, so I don't. Okay, so, all right, so what is this equivalent to? Well, Kant thinks this is equivalent to, so we haven't yet said anything about purposiveness. Kant thinks this is equivalent to thinking of nature as having been designed for the purpose of being known by us, of being able to be judged of. This is equivalent to thinking of nature as if it were set up just so it could be cognized by beings whose cognitive faculties happen to be arranged or set up in the ways ours are. Mm-hmm. And Kant will be even more clear in the second. And okay, so this then brings me full circle to the idea of technique Kant wants to introduce. That's what Kant calls the technique of nature, or that it's technical, that it's been sort of set up or designed in such a way. And so he says that it specifies all its empirical laws and kinds in a system. They're not just sort of there in front of you as an aggregate. You can always subsume them under an ever smaller number of principles so that you can come to grips with them because of the kind of knower judger that you are. Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and Kant, another name Kant gives that is formal purposiveness, because it's not only is it, so you might think, okay, well, this is difficult because there's going to be two kinds of purposiveness, one for life and the other for beauty and art, which we haven't discussed yet. But it gets even worse because there are actually two separate kinds, probably more, but two separate kinds of purposiveness, even for living beings or biology. Mm-hmm. So this is formal purposiveness. This is the purposiveness of nature as a whole, right? We haven't yet said anything about whether individual natural products, as Kant calls them, are purposively organized. So then that's the kind of transition to Kant's next topic. Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, so on page 10, he says the concept which originally arises from the power of judgment, it's proper to it, is thus that of nature as art. In other words, that of the technique of nature with regard to its particular laws. I think it's important to be careful here because Kant, he's not yet meaning to introduce the topic of fine arts or beauty. It's really art in the sense of artifice, that which is artificial, that which is a product of, well, he would say a concept of an end, but we don't need to worry about that so much now. Okay, so what do I want to say here? Okay, so hopefully that much is clear. But I haven't yet really said anything about how this fits in or how this addresses unresolved issues from the first critique. So the faculty of judgment wants things to be set up in such a way that every multiplicity of empirical laws and kinds can be organized under a small number of. But there's a way in which the first critique requires that to be the case too, I think. Wait, sorry, I'm not looking closely at the questions. Isn't the synthetic unity as a kind of, so Michelle Mograbi, did I pronounce your name correctly? Says, isn't the synthetic unity of appearances described on page 9 as a kind of condition of possibility for the discovery of categories under which experiences can be subsumed? So it's a very, very complicated question, but I'm getting, this is exactly the topic that I'm turning to now. Because synthetic unity of appearances, categories, that's all first critique talk. So in turning to the topic now of the first critique and how this supplements it, I mean to be addressing exactly this type of question. Okay, so Kant already gives us a story where we, our minds, more properly the understanding, are what he calls, in certain contexts, the lawgiver of nature. Mm-hmm. The laws of nature are due to our minds, which impose their form on any possible objects of experience. That's Kant's Copernican turn. We don't think of laws of nature or of causal structure as the things that are, that natural science and mathematics tell us are in the world as sort of out there, independent of us. We think of them as in some way dependent on our minds. Perhaps not wholly dependent. Kant kind of wants to hedge a little bit and say, well, it's just the formal structure of objects that's dependent on our mind and not the objects themselves. I'm not a stark, a foaming at the mouth lunatic idealist like Berkeley, who thought that really everything is a product of your mind or God's mind or something. I'm like a much more moderate type of guy. But basically, that's the story you get in the first critique. So how does that then intersect with this story? Okay, well, in the following way. The principles of the first critique that, or the condition, you say, conditions on the possibility of experience, the principles that our mind brings to bear in coming to grips with its experience, and those which make natural, scientific, and mathematical knowledge of the world possible, have a special status. They're in a way non-optional for us, because there could not even be experience of objects without them. because they literally serve to constitute or make objects. Make up, constitute. So there's a way in which, of all the different things that are flying around and that Kant is going to talk about, which serve some role in making experience tractable for us, they have a really special, significant position. You know, you really can say that every object, possible object of experience, must have a cause. Whereas, what we've said about the principle of the faculty of judgment, that we can always find small numbers of more general concepts under which specific concepts can be subsumed, or small numbers of general laws under which specific laws can be subsumed, that's regulative. Although transcendental, and it's very nuanced, and Kant kind of applies distinction after distinction. He's cutting things very fine, and I don't really know what to say about it, but you know, whatever, this presentation. Yeah. Nobody's in your pants, it's fine. So now question. But nevertheless, this latter thing, the way I interpret it, and this maybe is a little controversial. I once had an argument with someone about it. Kant, in a way, I think, is saying that the conclusion of the first critique, that the categories, which are things like causality, substance, they're all the concepts that natural science uses, and they, Kant takes himself to have shown they constitute objects of experience. They don't apply to things in themselves, things out there in the world, wholly independent of us, but they constitute objects of experience. So I think what Kant is saying is, well, that in a way radically underdetermines the nature of our experience. All it tells us is certain very general things about the way our experience has to be. So for example, every event has a cause. Or causes precede their effects in time, or all objects of experience are encountered in space. But as it were, you don't get anything with as rich and concrete and anything as concrete a structure as the world we inhabit. So what I'm saying is that it underdetermines the world of our experience and its nature. So what we need then is the faculty of judgment to pick up where the categories leave off. So we have these 12, there are 12 of them, principles, things like, every event has a cause, everything, object is substance and accident, blah, blah, blah. And we then need to sort of take these categories and specify them further by sort of hooking them up with the much more specific things. An event having a cause doesn't yet get us all the way to, this glass falling on the ground and breaking, and that having a cause. So how do we do it? How do we put these two together? How do we bridge the gap from the very maximally universal to the maximally specific? I think the principle of judgment is doing the job, because it takes all these particulars, subsumes them under ever more general concepts until we get back up to something like cause, substance. So I think somebody was talking about transcendental chaos is what we need to worry about if the categories don't even apply. We can't even say every event has a cause. Empirical chaos is what we further need to worry about if we can't say, empirical kinds fall under ever more general kinds, empirical laws fall under ever more general laws. I think they're linked in a certain sense, and minimally just in that solving the problem of transcendental chaos, the problem of the first critique, leaves open the possibility that there's empirical chaos, and then maximally just in the sense that empirical chaos would mean transcendental chaos, because if everything is sui generis, if everything is anomalous, if every new object is of a fundamentally new kind, then we would never be in a position to subsume them under very general concepts like categories like cause or substance or anything like that. Okay, so that's my sense of how those two things relate, maybe responding to Michelle's question. So now someone asks, isn't this why world as a regulative idea is relevant to this third critique? I would say, well, not to be sort of dismiss, I would say no. I would say it's not the same world.
Right.
Nature as a whole, as a system, is not quite the same thing as what we were talking about in the first critique, because the world in the first critique is, let's put it this way. When you think of nature as a whole, formal purposiveness, this third critique thing, think of one of those Linnaean classificatory trees that you've probably seen of, like, all these species fall under this genus and then that one. Really, the natural world, the world of organic life, When you think of the world in the first critique, think of, again, what Kant calls it, cosmology, rational cosmology, things like, was the, the Big Bang, was there a first cause? Was there something that kicked it all off? Is there an outermost limit in space, or does it go on forever? Outermost limit in time, or does it go on forever? Does it have an ultimate underlying ground, or is it, turtles all the way down? It's much more cosmological, much more in a physics kind of neighborhood. This is much more biological. It's about nature here on Earth, and how that's organized. And this kind of reflects Kant's preference, I think, for physics over biology, just to say, well, it's not exactly the world of the first critique is more important, and you could even, in some sense, it's less, but that Kant will give a kind of constitutive status to the categories of natural science, Newtonian natural science, and just say, relegate the idea of formal purposiveness to merely some serving to regulate our thinking. Regulate how? Well, when you're looking around, you go out into the world, you're Linnaeus, and you investigate, and you find all different kinds of rocks. You have this sort of faith that they can all be subsumed under some kind or some small number of kinds. Okay, so sorry, maybe I'm going too fast, right?
Well, no, this is excellent, Jacob. Maybe in view of time, though, you could wrap up your main points, and then we could take a few minutes to see if there are further questions for you. But I'm seeing that the questions are kind of rolling in via chat. But yeah, if you could wrap up your main, very excellent points. Just
so I basically got through my first point. So let me now just sort of breeze past the other points. I just want to flag them just as things to come back to. Okay, so I haven't yet said anything. So nature as a whole, the faculty of judgment goes to with the assumption that it's designed or set up in such a way, perhaps by a god, we don't know, to be knowable by it. But then that doesn't tell, that's sort of purposiveness in the large. We want to know about purposiveness in the small. What about the idea that, individual things like the heart or the lungs or the eyes have been designed to serve a purpose in the organism? And Kant thinks, he wants to sort of run the same type of argument there too. That when the faculty of judgment and the way he connects the two topics is through this idea of aggregate and system. To view a living being as purposively organized is to see it as a system. It's to see all its particular parts or its particular subsystems as sort of falling under ever more general ones until you just get to the organism itself, that these are all subservient, right? So that's what it is to view it as just not an aggregate. You don't just think, well, there's a foot and there's a heart and there's a lung. No, you see them all as sort of, you again subordinate multiplicity to unity. You see all these things as serving one thing, overarching thing, which is the organism. And it's very different from how you look at just, a mere heap or I don't know, something that's not purposively organized. So the very same reason that the faculty of judgment is entitled to view nature as a whole, as a system rather than aggregate, as purposively organized, as set up to be known by it, is gonna give you the reason that it's entitled to view organisms as systems rather than aggregates, as purposively organized, as when we inquire into them, going from the parts to the whole and assuming that every part serves the whole, which is not an appropriate assumption when we're dealing with, I don't know, a pile of dirt, as opposed to a watch or an organism or something like that. Okay, so that's what I want to say very quickly about that. And then, so that's real purposiveness, right? One of them is formal purposiveness in the large, designed so as to be knowable by us using the faculty of judgment. The other is real, that's purposiveness in the small, that's the individual entities or organisms. And in both cases, this is regulative, not constitutive. Because we can't really tell a story about how, well, it wouldn't even be possible for us to encounter objects without this. We could encounter them, we could have experiences of them, but they wouldn't exhibit the kind of unity that the faculty of judgment demands. They have to exhibit the form of unity that the understanding demands, natural science demands, mathematics demands. That's non-optional. This, in a way, is a little, we could get by without it, but it might be pretty bad. And I was even suggesting a reason that if it got bad enough, it might really imperil or jeopardize what the understanding tries to do and what physics tries to do. Big problem for Kant because he wants to, to use sort of Cold War language, make the world safe for physics. Biology, less of a priority. Okay, so. Oh, and I didn't say yet anything about art. I'm just gonna, okay. The really important point that I want to just make, I'm gonna now have to be more selective, is that that's only one of the pieces of unfinished business Kant has from the first critique. The other one is reconciling the first critique with the second critique.
Yeah.
Reconciling theoretical reason with practical reason, reconciling the world picture of modern Newtonian natural science with the world picture we have as moral agents who are trying to, realize the good, and so on. And Kant is worried that nature might not be hospitable to our efforts to act, to realize moral ends. It's a bit of again, one of these issues where I think, psychoanalytically speaking, Kant is working through. He's returning to a topic that's a problem for him because he has a very famous solution to this problem in the first critique, the third antinomy, where he says, well, in the noumenal world, the world of things in themselves, we might be free and therefore morally responsible. In the phenomenal world, our actions are determined and so on. So he's got a kind of way of reconciling nature and freedom. But here it's the further problem, not of, as it were, explaining how they could coexist, but of explaining how one can affect the other. Because Kant doesn't just think that we need to be free to be moral, he thinks we need to have certain aspirations, among them the highest good. Being morally isn't just about acting for the right reason, it's about trying to bring about a certain kind of world, and we need to be able to look to nature and say, nature, it is at least possible that that type of world could exist in nature, or could be realized in nature. So that's the other piece of unfinished business, and very sadly, I didn't say anything about art, but maybe I could just very quickly say that, okay, the thing about art is that, okay, go back to the faculty of judgment. It has a particular, it finds a universal for it. Cup. This is a cup. What happens in the case of art is, or of works, beautiful works, is interesting because Kant wants that process to fail in a certain way. He wants to say we can't find a concept for it. And we remain arrested at this stage where we have the particular, we're trying to find a concept for it, and in a way we can't, because, and it's sort of intuitive that, we don't really have a definition of what it is for something to be beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. I mean, you talk to philosophers who try to say what it is that distinguishes something as a work of art as opposed to some other kind of thing. The jury's still out, as opposed to a cup, which we probably could give a definition or something. So there's a way in which this process fails. And so it's an instance of reflective judgment where we never rise quite to the point of finding a concept for this. What happens, for complex reasons, is that the imagination kind of gets into what Kant calls free play. There's a sort of play of the imagination because the understanding, which is the faculty that's in charge of finding a concept, has sort of failed, and there's a sort of liberation from, I think, you read French philosophers of the 20th century and people who think there really is a kind of wild side to Kant's account of aesthetic judgment in First Third Critique, where you're freed from the strictures of having to understand the world in the way natural science demands, and you kind of are opened up to a type of non-cognitive enjoyment, basically. Nevertheless, which has all these kind of interesting properties that make it different from pleasure, mere pleasure, or hedonism, or something. Okay, well, all right. Well, that's okay. I had more to say, but I guess I better stop.
If I cut you off, Jacob, it is only or principally because I don't want to set a precedent where our rapporteurs just take too much time, but really this has been fantastic and exemplary, I would even say, and has done some really important work of kind of giving us, I think, big picture third critique and critical project in a way that permits us now for the rest of the day to do some tying off of finer threads, right, which is perfect. But I think we can take 5 or 6 minutes, and I see the rave reviews coming in. It's been awesome. Thanks, Jacob. So, it's not just me who's saying that. But we can take maybe 5 minutes until 1:20 to see if there are any questions for Jacob that didn't get asked before. You could even ask them with the mic rather than with
Yeah.
chat, if you like.
Yeah, I have a question,
Whitney.
if I may. So I wanted to say this out instead of typing it all in, but I have a question about the idea of an anomaly, or as somebody put it, quote unquote, the specter of empirical chaos. So if I understand you correctly, what it means to have something be able to be subsumed under a concept is to, in a certain way, to be able to make an attribution about it, or to make a predication. So if you have a cup and you say this is a cup, or this is glass, or this is plastic, I'm assuming that being able to subsume it under those concepts means like making those attributions. So that brings me to the question of that not being possible in the case of an anomaly. So does that just mean that there's a thing that you can't make any attributions about, and you can't say anything about it because you can't subsume it under any concept? Is it ineffable in a way?
That's a really good question. I guess I was thinking, well, I mean, take Kant's example of Linnaeus and the granite.
Mm-hmm.
He comes upon something that really looks exactly like every piece of granite he's seen so far, but Kant says, look, nothing rules out the possibility that burrowed within this piece of granite, you know, hidden in the depths, is something that makes it a fundamentally different kind of thing. So it's not that, you know, all of our efforts to classify this thing come to grief. It's more that we can't reach a definitive verdict or a final verdict about what in fact it is, because who knows? You know, maybe it'll turn out to have some, you know, something inside that makes it a different chemical.
That's a strange example for a lot of reasons. One is that it calls to mind Lockean nominalism, or, you know, the idea that any attempt to specify precisely that structure, such that if it's not there in a given thing, then it's not the kind of thing we thought it was, is always going to be furtive or beyond our means. It's somewhat curious to see Kant speaking in those terms, and it's also somewhat curious to see him invoking granite in this connection, because granite would be a perfect example of something that Jake described earlier, not using these terms, but of what Leibniz would call an ens per aggregatum, or an entity by aggregation, right?
Yeah.
In stark contrast with what Kant calls an organized being, and what we sometimes call an organism, right? That is to say, something that we can be confident is what it is, in virtue of the fact that its kidneys and its tongue and its feet are all working together to help it do what it does best, right? With granite, there's no such suspicion of a working together of the parts. Indeed, we don't even have the suspicion that we might reasonably have for crystals, which Kant also invokes sometimes, that they are what they are in virtue of the regular repetition of discernible structures. So that's just an aside, but because we were focusing so much on that note, I wanted to say how strange that note is for a number of reasons. Anyhow, but I didn't mean to interrupt.
I don't have anything to add. I mean, it's just one sort of small nitpicky point is that when we're talking about formal purposiveness of nature as a whole, lots of things besides organisms, i.e. things that are purposive in the small, or things that are themselves systems, become relevant. So gold, nobody thinks that gold is an organism or that all the parts subserve the whole. Nevertheless, it's relevant to that process of seeing nature as a whole as purposive. So somehow when we're talking about nature as a whole as purposive, the sphere of things or types of things that are relevant is wider than when we're talking about individual natural products, where I think it's pretty much organisms, maybe crystals, But yeah.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and we're going to see Kant fleshing out in detail what Jacob just described when we get to the critique of teleological judgment, and also there, indeed, we're going to see Kant returning to what looks like his acquired specialist knowledge in the discipline of geography, when he starts asking questions of the sort, "What is moss for?" And he realizes you can only begin to answer that question by looking at the reindeer that eat the moss, and in turn at the indigenous people who herd the reindeer, and this looming massive question of what any of that is for, as we'll see, is huge for Kant, and starts also to point to questions well beyond scientific geography or biology and into the domain of the political. But that was also just an aside. Are there other questions for Jacob to address before we move on? Thanks again, Jacob. That was fascinating. I had a number of loose strands, or things I wanted to pick up on that you already touched on. And again, I think what's really valuable about your talk was that it was very, very synthetic and helpfully big picture, giving us a big picture grasp of a lot of material, right? I had some questions as you were talking, and indeed as I was reading, about this difficult notion of technique and the technical. And I'd like to take maybe 15 to 20 minutes to talk about the peculiar interconnection between a cluster of concepts in Kant in the introduction, namely technique, mechanism, teleology, and purposiveness. These are huge topics, and I feared as you were talking that some people, certainly not everyone, but some people might need a bit more introductory investigation of these concepts. So you have used the term purposiveness a number of times. It's going to occur throughout the text, probably even more so in the second half in the critique of teleological judgment. And it is a term that obviously has something to do with teleology, obviously has something to do with the much shorter term purpose. Purposiveness is, I don't want to say hackneyed, but let me say forced at least, technical term in the translation of Kant. In German, it is Zweckmäßigkeit. Let me see if I can write that out for you, because it's a whopper. And I'm not gonna load German onto you, but there are a few cases where I think it's important to appreciate the artifice of what we're reading in Geyer and Wood's English. Purposiveness is an example. They give us purposiveness as a pair with purpose, and purpose is Zweck, which could also be in most ordinary German goal, maybe like your daily fitness goals or something like that. Could also be Zweck, right? Now, why did we need this pair? Why both purposiveness and purpose? This will be fully fleshed out in the critique of teleological judgment. But the idea is that traditionally, teleology, just to review for some of you, but to cover the basics for others of you, teleology is a central element of a philosophy of nature or of natural philosophy that by the middle of the 18th century has been so severely problematized that a critical thinker like Kant cannot simply adopt it uncritically. Right? Teleology is the view according to which every natural thing develops or moves towards its particular ends or purposes in view of the fact that it is what it is, right? So for Aristotle, an acorn develops into an oak because it is the becoming of oak that is the telos or purpose or end of the particular natural being that is an acorn, right? Now, a large part of the third critique is devoted to, as we mentioned last time, bumping up or taking on the problem of the limits of teleological understanding of nature, which is to say that, as Jacob has already explained, you can't simply naively suppose that in looking at any particular natural being, you're going to know what it is for, right? So that gets you into this kind of scheme of relativization where you look at moss, and the only way that you can determine what it is for is by considering what lies beyond it in a somewhat, you might say, proto-ecological way. Whereas for Aristotle, you could exhaustively and satisfyingly understand what moss is or what an acorn is without looking at what eats these things, for example, just for example. So purposiveness, then, Zweckmäßigkeit, is a kind of compromise term that acknowledges the impossibility of simply reading ends off of natural beings, while at the same time facing up to the fact that you cannot apprehend anything in nature without kind of bringing an idea of teleology to it, right? That is, you can no longer naively suppose that in looking at an acorn or moss or a gazelle, you know what their specific natural ends are, but you would be equally naive to do what the mechanists had been trying to do, and suppose that in looking at moss or an acorn or a gazelle, you can in fact cognize these as systems of gears and levers and pulleys, right? And if you imagine that that's what you're doing in your apprehension of living nature, then you are as naive as someone, as an Aristotelian who imagines that they can discern specific natural ends, right? So in that respect, we're going to see again and again this contrast between purpose and purposiveness, and we're also going to see such peculiar formulations as I love the German Zwecklose Zweckmäßigkeit, purposeless purposiveness, right? We'll get to that. I don't want to give you the details of it, but already now in the introduction, when we're engaging with the idea of purposiveness, we should understand it as the product of Kant's difficult positioning between mechanism and teleology, right? I hope by now the notion of teleology is clear. This as well is something that there are plenty of resources at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and elsewhere to follow up on if you're still perplexed. Now, back to technique, which was another element of this cluster that I wanted to consider. Jacob helpfully analyzed it. I found myself wondering about the full web of its semantic significance as I was going back through the introduction. One thing that really struck me this time was the extent to which he contrasts technique with mechanism, right? He insists that there is a technique of nature, or that nature is cognizable qua technique, and this is not to deny that nature might also be cognizable in mechanical terms, but it is to mark out an important conceptual distinction. Now, one thing to recall about technique is that it is semantically rooted in the same Greek term that gives us technology and technocracy and technical and all of these terms, and that in Greek, in techne, is the only available word for what we might variably translate as both art and craft, right? And when we see Aristotle, for example, carrying on about artifice and thinking, for example, of the artifice that is the bed in contrast with the natural substance that is the wood and stuff like that. That's generally techne, right? So this is interesting for for the project of the third critique because it's something that that is most familiar to us from the realm of art, And yet that Kant is very insistent on applying to the apprehension of nature, right? And this is not, as we'll see, because Kant thinks that nature is a great artifice, or that it was designed by a master craftsman. Again, as I explained at the beginning today, Kant thinks that that is something that is strictly beyond our capacity to affirm in a kind of no holds barred in the no holds barred fashion of the older metaphysicians. And Kant is obviously here, as I think we've discussed, aware of and responding to the so-called watchmaker argument of people like William Paley, who take it for granted that if, say, an alien were walking along the surface of the earth and did not yet know that the earth was inhabited, but then found a pocket watch on the ground, even if the alien didn't grasp the concept of chronometry as embodied by that artifice, the alien could still look at the gears and dials and so on, and infer, wow, this planet is inhabited by some rational beings. Now, given that, the standard cosmological argument went a fortiori, or all the more, if you are walking along and you see a deer run by in the forest, and say you shoot the deer and cut it open and see its kidneys and heart and so on. If you're prepared to infer technique in the sense of putting parts together so that they might interwork, in the case of a timepiece, then all the more should you be prepared to make such an inference in the case of the deer, right? So that's an argument that is familiar from William Paley, that's familiar from medieval Islamic philosophy. It's a classic argument for the existence of God, and the existence of God qua artisan, qua master craftsman, right? Kant rejects it. Kant does not believe that it is a viable argument. And yet, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see your comment, Jacob, but might there be some role for intelligent design in Kant's conception of nature, even if he denies it fully cognitive or scientific status? Wow, huge question. Yeah, I mean, we're going to get to not just intelligent design, but also the kind of rumblings of the possibility of evolution in Kant, which he rejects. This is something I've written myself on quite a bit, that for the most part falls outside the scope of even the critique of teleological judgment. In Kant's work on the so-called, on the different races of men of 1775-76, he gives a pretty clear account of why he rejects evolution in the sense of speciation, and how we can account for variety within a species, even in the absence of evolution. For example, the variety of different human races. So there's a lot to be said about that. And given that Kant shies away from evolution, even in close dialogue with people like Georges Cuvier, who are also comparative anatomists, who are also bumping up against the increasingly kind of weighty evidence for the descent of kinds. He shies away from it. And in the shying away from it, as I think Jacob rightly suggests, there is some kind of commitment, however tentative or non-cognitive, let's say positive, not non-dogmatic, that's the word I'm looking for. There's still some kind of commitment to an idea of the totality of nature as design, right? So, but my only point about this very difficult question is that even if there is such a commitment, it's not going to be a dogmatic commitment. It's going to be a commitment that faces up to all of the critical challenges that come with affirming such a thing, right? All right. So we'll look at a lot more of that kind of problem when we get to the second half, and it's not my purpose here to give you any kind of sneak previews of the second half, or to weight the second half more fully in the discussion than the first half, but only to acknowledge at the outset that this question of purposiveness is a very difficult one. Now, I just sent you a little JPEG image of a screenshot I took of a very helpful chart that Kant gives rather towards the end of the second part of the second introduction, almost all the way to the end of the reading that we had for today, that I want to look at together with you in order to make sense of some of what we've already been saying, but also to see maybe a bit more what Kant is trying to do with the notion of purposiveness. So he identifies three faculties of the mind: cognition, pleasure and displeasure, and desire. And obviously, in some respect, cognition has been the primary concern of the first critique. The higher cognitive faculty that engages with cognition is understanding, whose a priori principles are whose a priori principle, as Kant identifies it, is lawfulness, and whose product is nature, right? And that's remarkable for all sorts of reasons. If we look at that first line and then kind of bookend it with the final line, the faculty of desire, where the higher cognitive faculty is reason, the product is morals, you can start to see that here there's some kind of mapping with the first and the last of these of the faculties to the first and the second of the critiques, and that we have now the faculty of the mind that is pleasure and displeasure, and whose higher cognitive faculty is judgment, in the middle here as the focus of the present critique, and as the bridge, affirming this suggestion we've already seen, that the critique of the power of judgment is going to bridge the theoretical and practical philosophies. In other words, the first and the second critique. So we're not just tying up loose ends. We're not just looking at the philosophy of art and the philosophy of biology because they're interesting, but rather we're bridging the two principal branches of the critical philosophy, namely the theoretical and practical branches. So there's that, and that's interesting. But if we look at the middle line, we are immediately struck, I think, by the fact that Kant is now identifying purposiveness as the principle of the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, in the same way that he has already identified lawfulness as the principle of the faculty of cognition. Right? So just as you bring the laws of nature as given in the faculty of the understanding to your experience of to your experiences, thereby yielding what is called nature as outlined in the first critique. So similarly, you bring purposiveness to your feelings of pleasure and displeasure in the rendering of judgments, the product of which is art. And that's what I wanted to emphasize, the strangeness of the fact that the product here is art, in contrast with nature, which is the domain of the first critique. Even though, again, in the third critique, we are getting a thorough study, not just of art, but also of nature, right? Nature now in a different sense, nature in a sense that, that seems to be best captured under this notion that Jacob already described as technique. I see a question, but I'm not seeing the chart. Goodness, sorry. Do other people see the chart that I just sent along? You do, okay. I'm getting a yes, and a yes. I sent it as a JPEG file in the chat to everybody. I'm sorry if y'all aren't getting it. It's also in the text. Maybe someone can quickly tell us which page, if you have it handy. Jacob is going to resend it to us all. Can someone find the page very quickly? 83. Thank you, Ognan. It's on page 83 of the PDF of the whole work. Someone says, could someone also please share the PDF? I will. Well, yeah, if someone can do that quickly. I was going to say, if you don't have the PDF, it's because you're a late joiner, and I already sent it around earlier. But if someone could throw that PDF again into the chats, that would be fantastic. Thank you, Jacob Greenstein and Hal Cunningham. Oh crap! We're getting towards the end of the time, and I'm seeing some questions coming in. What I wanted to emphasize, and let me just finish that thought in looking at the chart, is that in spite of what you might think about this chart, or on a kind of first kind of gloss of what he's trying to say, the study of the power of judgment, even if it corresponds to the faculty of the mind that is pleasure and displeasure, and its a priori principle is purposiveness, and its product of art is, and its product is art. Nonetheless, this is not to say that that it's somehow going to be reducing the organized beings studied in the critique of teleological judgment to art, or that that somehow art takes precedence over organized beings in understanding how the power of judgment works. There is a curious suggestion, and we're going to keep coming back to this on a number of occasions throughout the seminar. There is a curious suggestion that I think is something we're not going to solve today, but that we just need to flag, that Kant is prepared to see nature by analogy to art, and that it is art that gives us kind of the key to understanding nature, even though in the end nature is less certain than art, because with nature, unlike art in the traditional sense, we have no positive knowledge. That is to say, no nothing given to the understanding of the artificer, right? And there is a kind of tradition of interpreting Kant. I don't think it's the most prominent or indeed promising tradition of interpreting Kant. I'm thinking, for example, of this funny, not funny, but curious work by a somewhat obscure German philosopher of the late 19th, early 20th centuries named Kai Feihinger, called Die Philosophie des Als ob, which might be translated as the philosophy of the as if, right? And Feihinger places Kant in this lineage of philosophers who are cognizant of the limits of our knowledge, that is, for example, of the impossibility of taking the artificer of nature before the understanding, and yet nonetheless want to understand nature on analogy to art. Already in the introduction, I think there is some concern that that is the direction that Kant is going in, that the only way we're going to understand natural teleology is on analogy to works of art, or as if the things of nature, as if the things of nature were cognizable through the model of works of art. I think that is simplistic, even if it's suggested in the introduction by Kant himself. And one of my principal concerns over the next weeks is going to be to try to give a more kind of complicated interpretation of Kant's understanding of the relationship between the two. All right, I had a few questions, and then I want to address a few concepts. Well, man, we're really running short on time. The other concepts I wanted to cover by the end of today. I think we've done teleology, we've done purposiveness, we've done technique. We have not yet done aesthetic, taste, beauty, or sublimity. We might have to hold those for another time, well, namely next week. But let us try to answer this one question, which I think is from Chris Noble, whom I'm happy to have among us. Chris Noble is one of many people among us who is a former student and now a colleague. So Chris asks, on the topic of design, chaos, and nature, I suspect Kant creates a problem for himself that, say, Leibniz would not face, which is that individual things are always subsumed under finite concepts, general laws. Someone like Leibniz can conceive intelligent design in terms of God's use of infinitely complex concepts for individual singular things. Indeed, yes, Chris, that's not a question, but that's a perfectly suitable comment. And Chris, like me, is also primarily a Leibnizian, and we're going to, I hope, spare you our Leibnizianizing tendencies throughout the seminar. I did want to mention, though, and I don't have the page numbers handy, but I did want to mention that Kant does take a few digs at Leibniz already in the introduction. In particular, Kant doesn't mock, but he at least identifies as no longer cutting it certain basic metaphysical principles of Leibniz, in particular the principle of plenitude. If someone could identify that page for us, that would be helpful. It would take too much time away if I were to start scanning through the PDF. When Kant says something to the effect that, of course, there are all these principles floating around out there. For example, that between any two given species, there is another species occupying a middle ground, a tertium quid. But in effect, that's just people saying stuff, right? You'll recall I've identified Leibniz several times as one of Kant's kind of go-to whipping boys as a representative of the no-holds-barred metaphysical tradition. If you want to see an example of that, a good one is Kant's rejection of the principle of plenitude in the introduction to the Critique of Judgment. All right, maybe now, are there any questions? Are there any quick questions to tie off? I see people ducking out already, and that's fine. If you've got to go, you got to go. But let me just try in the 3 minutes remaining to say a few words about the more first half focused concepts, because that's where we're going to be heading in the next few weeks. Taste for Kant, which he already addresses in the introduction, will be very important, obviously, beginning next week. He understands it as the faculty for judging the beautiful, and therefore the key concept that comes into play in the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment. Taste is in effect, the aesthetic power of judgment. It applies not just to the beautiful, right? We also have the sublime in the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, and indeed we have many different categories, or at least not many, but we have different categories of the sublime, and it's also with the sublime, I think, in the first half that we have a constant reminder that we're also never very far from such features of the natural environment as the oceans or precipices or the heavens, which of course painters try to capture, and indeed German Romantic painters like Caspar David Friedrich kind of iconically or emblematically are trying to capture in painting something like what Kant will focus our attention on with his analysis of the sublime. But the sublime need not be given to us by painters like Caspar David Friedrich. It's there for us to experience if we go stand on the beach at night or on a cliffside any time of day. That is just to say that in what is to come, nature will never be far, even if we're talking about art, and vice versa. Art will never be far, even if what we're talking about is nature, as I hope we've begun to see today. All right. Also, let me see. Beauty, obviously, for a long time it was supposed that art must be beautiful in order to succeed. Obviously, in the 20th century, or beginning with the 20th century, that was no longer the case. Much modern art is, and by modern I mean, let's say 20th century and beyond, we are familiar with the idea that the artist is trying to give us something that is interrogating the category of the beautiful without trying to be beautiful itself, or perhaps is trying to give us something ugly to tear down the category of the beautiful. There are lots of different possibilities. But in any case, even for Kant, and this is my final point, even for Kant, aesthetic experience need not be experience of the beautiful, right? There is a much broader category of experience that can be analyzed within the context of the critique of aesthetic judgment, besides simply standing in front of say, a painting and intersubjectively judging that that is one beautiful painting. All right, I'm already 1 minute over. I'm so sorry to go over time. I try to be punctual. I saw we lost maybe 10 people in the last 15 minutes. I hope it's not because it got dull or something towards the end. You are, of course, free to come and go. And I'm delighted that you all made it through to the end. I will be emailing you with further instructions for next week very shortly. If we have anyone who is inclined to present, well, actually, I've already got a list of people who mentioned they would like to present, but if you want to jump in there, please let me know as soon as you can. Don't let being a beginner to this material dissuade you from taking the plunge and presenting, okay? Are there any questions? All right, thank you everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.